Africana Studies scholars. With new maternalities, for example, mothering men, caretaking men, single fathers, lone parents, queer parents, etc. Thank you. Mothering, motherwork, motherhood, and maternalism can no longer be referred to as a purely gender phenomenon, because we do actually have men who are mothering. And as long as we continue to look at mothering and motherhood as a women's thing, we're not truly studying it in its entirety. So the question I want to bring here is, where is motherhood studies in Africana studies? As motherhood studies continues to burgeon globally, it is critical to raise the question, what role will Africana and African studies scholars play? In view of the established centrality of motherhood in African cultures, we cannot afford to sit back while other people lead this field as it develops. So globally, motherhood studies is coming of age. Many women's and gender studies departments now have motherhood studies experts on their faculty body. There are journals and publishing presses dedicated specifically to motherhood studies. And motherhood studies professional bodies are springing up, and along with them, conferences on motherhood studies. Concurrently, Africana studies is coming full circle in defining a space for critical African studies. Africanists continue to challenge the application of Eurocentric paradigms to the study of the African world and its contained phenomena, physical, abstract, and practiced. Africana studies specialists cogitate and take on the revising and rewriting of histories, pedagogy, and epistemology, and are at the forefront of new frontiers of knowledge creation. It therefore makes absolute sense for us to raise the question, where is motherhood studies in African studies, or where is African studies in motherhood studies? Africana studies and its scholars should be honestly involved in the definition of motherhood studies, for a number of transparent reasons actually. First, it would be fulfilling its obligation to be active in the evolution of new scholarship globally. And as we've established, motherhood studies in the West is becoming this huge area of scholarship, and yet when I look around, besides myself and a couple of other people, there are no African scholars who dedicate their time to studying motherhood, which is weird when you consider how central motherhood is to African cultures and within African cultures. Second, it's important because most women in gender studies departments still primarily play to the tune of white feminists and define philosophies and disciplinary pedagogy from a white feminist perspective. It is safe to conclude that motherhood studies will be too, unless we step in as African scholars. In the absence of any intervention from us, once again, this area of scholarship will be defined by the West, by Western feminists and by Western scholars. This is already happening actually. Motherhood studies as an area of studies in the West is already being modeled along Eurocentric perspectives and paradigms. Philomena Steady, in an investigative framework for gender research in Africa in the millennium, observes that the postmodernist challenges by feminist scholars of the South included serious critiques of methodologies which questioned the right of Western feminists to assume dominance of the feminist discourse. And so again I ask us, where is Africana studies in motherhood studies? African feminism occupies a pretty curious location. As a subdiscipline, it is primarily acknowledged and given a home through Africana studies more than women's studies. This location is actually reminiscent of that which black women in the United States occupied in the United States of America in the 60s, where they were erased by feminism and at the same time erased by the civil rights movements. While both movements actually claim black women's bodies to legitimize, bodies and numbers, to legitimize their agenda. While African feminisms are recognized primarily through Africana studies, the disciplines of African and Africana studies still does not privilege it and distinguish it to a large extent as a women's studies concern. Women's studies, on the other hand, fares no better. It's actually worse, barely hiding the fact that their focus is on white and Western feminists. It is telling just how many departments of women's studies in the West do not have a specialist in African women's studies. even while they claim to espouse a global outlook and agenda. Perhaps global to them means the pathology and victimology applied to the third world and African women. Considering this, it is apparent, therefore, that in the immediate, progress and inclusion of African motherhood studies will require the complicity of Africana studies. Because tenets of motherhood in African cultures are at odds with how Western feminists view motherhood, it may even be necessary for Western feminists to silence African motherhood studies to meet the goals of their own agenda. And yet, Africana studies programs and professional bodies have not yet demonstrated recognition of their essential role in promoting African motherhood studies. This obvious non-attendance can certainly not be attributed to the fact that we are unaware of the significance of motherhood studies in African cultures, and therefore to the studies of African world as experienced through different cultures. Surely, if such a blind spot existed, then there are those who have dedicated their voice in academia to explicating this for us. The following scholars come to mind immediately: Oironke Oyewumi, Kirun Zegu, Philomena Stedi, Ifya Madume, Niara Sudakaza, Catherine Acholonu. Sadly, though, most of these are philosophers and sociologists who occasionally speak on motherhood studies, but do not focus on motherhood studies as an area, exclusively as an area. Like I argued before or explained before, besides myself, I know maybe a couple of other people who do this in Africana studies. So, why do these and a few others over the decades remain the lone voice in a desert of scholarship on this area? More importantly, why is their work on the subject viewed chiefly as a component of gender or women's studies or African family studies, cultural studies, or anthropology, but not enough attention is focused on it as a consequential area of different disciplines within Africana studies? If these studies were to receive the consideration and location of significance they deserve, historians would engage the importance of motherhood in history, the contribution of motherhood to decolonization processes, and even to the formation of societies and states across history, as would members of other disciplines of African studies. The case Paul Tiambe-Zeleza makes in Gender Biases in African Historiography for the gendering of African history applies here. I am a scholar of motherhood studies. Like most people who do work on the subject, my research in this area is accessed mainly for use in women's studies. Most scholars of African studies absolutely ignore the role mothers have played in the establishment of societies, in the creation of different societies, in the struggle for independence. In many, many areas, motherhood has always been central to the lives of African societies. Why then do we pay no attention to mothers, motherhood, mother work, mothering, maternalities, maternalisms when we do African studies in any area? The regrettable certainty is that the failure to foreground scholars of African motherhood studies and their work as the area of motherhood studies takes root globally will result in the appropriation of the thoughts of African scholars by Western scholars. This has happened with many disciplines, and it is now happening with motherhood studies. Insights that were posited years past by African scholars I have named above are now being claimed and defined as innovative thought in the name of feminist motherhood and feminist mothering by Western scholars. Once again, the margins are being robbed for their thought, and that thought appropriated to the center, Western feminism and Western scholarship. Engaging the challenge of alien paradigms in studying African spaces and concepts, Stedi argues that Eurocentric, quote, Eurocentric paradigms can lead to an abstract mapping of systems of stratification rather than a more profound interrogation of the very institution that determine such lines and parameters of social inquiry. Western feminist interests and approaches will not serve the study of the institution of motherhood in Africa until such a time that scholars of African cultures, philosophies, and histories have some control in women's studies departments or professional bodies outside the continent. And we all know that reality is a long way coming. Even if they were open to supporting African motherhood studies, approaches used within feminism to study motherhood in the West employ a world sense that is incompatible with the realities of African cosmology. Oyewumi captures one such misplaced notion the idea of single mother. She spotlights the term single mother as an oxymoron, explaining that from an African perspective, and as a matter of fact, mothers by definition cannot be single. In most cultures, motherhood is defined as a relationship of progeny, not as a sexual relationship to a man. Within the feminist literature, motherhood, which in many other societies constitutes the dominant identity of women, is subsumed under wifehood. Because woman is a synonym for wife, procreation and lactation in gender literature, traditional and feminist, are usually presented as part of the sexual division of labor. Marital coupling is thus constituted as the base of societal division of labor. This brings me to my next issue with this area of studies being championed by scholars of the West. One will be forced to search long and hard to come across talk or scholarship within African feminisms advocating a rejection of motherhood. Mothers and motherhood are afforded a particular reverence in their different articulations within African cultures. How then is it that it is out of a space that to some extent has resisted motherhood? Yes, I'm looking at you, radical second wave feminists in the West. That motherhood studies will be championed. Africana studies is failing in not defining a dedicated domicile for studies on motherhood and mothering within it. The question of who is the mother is always more crucial, even when the Western episteme invalidates it within African studies. To the extent that we accept the invalidation, we're actually privileging Western episteme in seeing, interpreting, and organizing cultural realities of Africa. It should be disconcerting that Western feminism, whose radical branches have been known to reject motherhood, has to champion, once again, another area of study while scholars of Africa play catch-up. What I'm saying is that departments, conferences, professional associations of African studies need to create an enthusiastic and committed place and resources for motherhood studies to bloom. The centrality of motherhood to and in scholarship on gender across disciplines is undeniable. As motherhood studies seeks maturation, a body of literature to support this development within Africana studies is called for. In contributing to this corpus demands a place on recognition that motherhood and mothering can constitute locations of social change and empowerment. Indeed, women's power bases are partly derived from cultural values that stress the potency of a female principle organizing life and reproduction through motherhood and centrality of children. There is a necessary sense of urgency to this issue. Should the participation of Africanists not be established now, Africana studies scholars will once again be involved in a catch-up and revisionist endeavor in this area, a process that ultimately slows down Africana scholarship. It is critical that Africana studies scholars define our own principles and methods of studying motherhood within an African reality. Playing catch-up contributes to slow developments as a consequence of how much effort it takes to rewrite history or rewrite scholarship that's already been done. Steady notes about what I refer to as catch-up scholarship. Quote, African research on gender has to develop methodologies for criticism and revisionist endeavors, as well as methodologies for alternative research. What I argue against that is that we should not be having a revisionist space. We should actually champion and be at the forefront of developing these methodologies and epistemologies towards this study. Speaking of methods, the exploration of motherhood seems to always occur in academia from an analytical perspective and continues to valorize the work of the Western scholars. Further, most analyses on the subject approach it from and through patriarchal characterizations and principally from a Western world understanding of the concept motherhood, or through the filter of pathology. Conceptualizing maternal power provides an insight into how individual men and women, and I stress men here, experience and define the phenomenon and space of motherhood and mothering located within specific historical, geographical, cultural, social, and economic spaces across African cultures. to delineate a space for scholarship on motherhood in Africa, we must first create a new center not beholden to Western academic center on the subject. For this to happen, we must engage stories of African motherhood. The Maragoli of Kenya proverb, Utaro na Nyabukana, dada yata mzazi ng'ombe, one who did not see their mother come to youth might think my father threw away the cows. Bride wealth in this case, reminds us that to fully engage the person of the mother, one must consider the individual woman's constitution and man's constitution and other roles and spaces occupied, including sister, brother, daughter, son, professional, aunt, uncle, religious being, to mention a few. It is crucial to recognize also, as Oyeronke Oyomi puts it, motherhood itself is not one thing. Mothering and motherhood, two are not private phenomena, and they're not wholly and absolutely personal. They happen in both the private and public sphere and bear impact beyond the immediate relationship of two people biologically or socially. Mitigating the missing lack of true narratives, no, I'll skip that. And I just want to reiterate in this finishing that there is a need to provide a space for the development of a dedicated area of motherhood studies in African studies. And so I leave you all with a question. Where is motherhood studies in African studies, or where is African studies in motherhood studies? Thank you.
Thank you, but Muhanja, for having stayed on time, first, and second, for this very eloquent call for action, I'm sure it will be